having ventured into the field of what I called modern occultism, which would be beginning with the latter part of the 19th century to the present, with having had a lecture on Annie Besant, and now on. So now we shall move. Let's see, what was our second lecture? First of all, Krishnamurti, of course. My goodness, how can you even mention Annie Besant without her discovery, Krishnamurti? So this evening we will conclude with a representative of the Western Esoteric Tradition, but still generically connected, I think, certainly with Annie Besant and with the Theosophical tradition, Max Heindel. And in that connection, I want to place this lovely and interesting figure into a meaningful context, which will allow us to view him and his work in within a larger framework. And therefore, I will begin with some explications, if possible, of the story of the Rosicrucians and of the Rosicrucian tradition. I did a talk somewhat connected with that a couple of months ago, but I felt that there was really a great deal more to be said, and hopefully I can do that right now. So there is no name that carries a greater mystique in occult and mystical traditions than that of the Rosy Cross. It is in fact less of a name and more of what nowadays we would call an archetype. Just kind of think about it a little bit and try to conjure it in front of your face. The cross, which is the symbol of the Christian cycle of revelation, although of course there are cruciform iconic objects in all kinds of religions, going clear back to ancient Egypt or elsewhere, but also let's say the cross echoes connection, as I just said, of a more arcane nature in Egypt and other pre-Christian mysteries where the cross was used. And now added to that the rose, the mystic flower of the West, the Occidental equivalent of the mysterious Eastern lotus. Lotus is the sacred flower of the East, while certainly the rose is of the West. So instead of the crucifix with its anthropomorphic sacrificial keynote, the sacrifice of the cross, or of the bare and uninspired cross of Protestant sanctuaries, the flower of the world, Rosa Mundi, as it was called in Latin among the alchemists and many others, the Rosa Mundi upon the cross, instead of the others that I mentioned, the rose transfigured and elevated, so it becomes the Rosa Mystica, the mystic rose of the flowering of the Spirit. So already the image is a stimulating one. I may have been about, I don't know, maybe about 14 years old or so when I first read in a German book about the Rosenkreuzer, and the whole image of a cross and the rose grabbed me so much that I was quite transfigured thereby, and that was in a period of time when to be transfigured in a good way was very, very rare, because it was immediately after the occupation of my homeland by the Soviet Russians, and all kinds of unhappy and nasty things going on. Yet just hearing about the Rosy Cross gave me such a wonderful feeling that I never forgot it. So the Rosa Mundi, the rose of the world, becomes the Rosa Mystica, the mystic rose. So with the symbol, of course, goes an ancient legend, which has historical dimensions, but is in reality, I would say, from beyond time. And you know, those are the stories that are really the most valuable and ultimately the most productive for us, because they are in the nature of a myth. No one knows when and how Rosicrucianism or the mysteries of the Rosy Cross had their inception. All we know that 3 short books, almost pamphlets we would call them nowadays, were published in Germany, the first 2 in the city of Kassel, and the last one in Strasbourg, the publication being in the 2-year period between 1614 and 1616, which in these books were entitled as follows, in Latin, the Fama Fraternitatis, which means the story of the brotherhood. Second, the Confessio Fraternitatis, the confession or revelation of the brotherhood. And the third one, the Chemische Hochzeit Christiani Rosenkreuz, the chemical wedding of Christian Rosy Cross. Now, you have probably been present in one way or the other at weddings. I seriously doubted that you were present at a chemical wedding. But if you remember, shall we say, the importance and the frequent function of chemistry, say in the 1960s, then maybe you might have experienced a chemical wedding. I don't know, but let's say that is the title, and I'll tell you in a minute why. So these publications were in Latin and German, and soon became known in other languages as well. The books were anonymous in terms of their authorship, but it was fairly well known that at least the last of the 3, the chemical wedding, had as its author a Johann Valentin Andreae, who died in 1654 and who was a prominent Protestant minister. In fact, he was the dean of the biggest Lutheran church in the wonderful little city in Baden-Württemberg named Calw, which has also other distinctions of a literary and related nature. Johann Valentin Andreae was from Swabia originally, and certainly his main profession was that of a minister and a theologian, who then came to reside in Württemberg, in Calw, as or as it is called, Baden-Württemberg now, wasn't at that time, and he in turn belonged to a circle formed around a professor of law of the University of Tübingen, which is very nearby, and which I visited, and it was in the summertime, and we went from Kalf over to Tübingen, very short distance. It was one of the most enchanting, charming places in the world. This is beautiful old university buildings, right quite on the edge of the Schwarzwald, of the Black Forest, which, to my surprise, is actually quite black. You know, you said, what the heck, a forest is supposed to be green. But the nature of the trees that are planted there and the proximity of the trees to each other make the forest really look quite black. So I said, well, the Schwarzwald is really a Schwarzwald. It is really is a black forest. And there are, you know, all kinds of, I mean, if I start telling stories about my travels, then we'll never get around to Max Heindel, and he's too nice a fellow to leave out by the wayside. But, you know, this much I will say, that whole area around the Black Forest, with the various little towns and all that, is really a magical country, and not only in the metaphorical sense. But the people who live there, every other person you meet is a magician, a fortune teller, a sorcerer, a psychic, both men and women. Very interesting people, and they are very unassuming about it. You know, it's not the kind of thing like, oh, I don't know, as you would find in, shall we say, California, you know, they don't call attention to their status, but they're there, and if you converse with them, you find out that they're very unusual people. So it's an unusual place, beautiful, beautiful, because summer, everything was full of flowers, was really gorgeous. So anyway, at that University of Tübingen was there already at that particular time. Anyway, there was a professor, I suppose they were called that already then, at the Tübingen University at that time, and this professor was a mentor of Johann Valentin André. When Johann Valentin André was still a young man, he wrote the book, or perhaps all the three books, and he was obviously inspired and perhaps guided and instructed by others. And by when I say the book is the Chemische Hochzeit, the chemical wedding. Now, modern historians, among whom honorable mention should be made, contemporary and almost contemporary historians, Elik Howe, an English writer, and perhaps even more the notable and outstanding and brilliant Dame Frances Yates, who I'm sure is also deceased by now, who was really the reviver of scholarly and popular interest in the Hermetic tradition in our times. She wrote first her sort of her magnum opus on the beginnings of Renaissance Hermeticism, and then a whole bunch of others. And so these are the people who we should give some credit to in terms of reliable contemporary or information of contemporary vintage regarding the Rosicrucian tradition, Rosicrucian books also. On the basis of the material that these and some other historians, insightful historians, not those historians who murder history, because they are around too. When after a couple of pages you feel like putting a history book down, then you can be quite sure that that was written by a murderer of history. But these people are really rather different. And on the basis of their insights, I have become inclined to think that the Rosicrucian books, the three that I mentioned, were designed to attack the pretensions of the vulgar and superstitious folk who passed, let us say, by our standards of description, who would pass for the occultists of that time. Alchemists and occultists of the period who, let us say, had taken these disciplines into areas of literature and areas of interest which are not really of interest, who really contributed to alchemy and some of the occult arts that were available at ceremonial magic and others of becoming something undesirable at the time. And that apparently Johann Valentin Andrea wanted to restore respect for and interest in the, let's say, in the alternative mysticism that was available at that time. The content of the three books bears testimony to an intention that closely resembles the one put forth by Dame Frances Yates particularly, who I think is a very, very insightful writer. So rather than sort of the how to do it books of gold making, in other words, popular and useless kind of alchemy, or of the acquisition of occult powers, whereby one may manipulate people and forces in the world. These three Rosicrucian books are, for the most part, mystical stories, replete with archetypal symbols, and they have a peculiar dreamlike quality, so that one gets the distinct feeling that they represent something, well, sort of something out of this world, or perhaps even out of mind, at least outside the conscious mind. This is less true, perhaps, of the second book, the Confessio, which at least ostensibly deals with the reasons and purposes of the Rosicrucian Brotherhood, but the reasons are once again stated rather mythologically, and about the only thing that one can ascertain with a degree of certainty is that the author is opposed to certain dogmatic and intolerant institutions, among which he prominently mentions the papacy, Islam, and quack alchemists. So it's an interesting company of three. What emerges out of this literature then is an effort to bring to the attention of those whose interests lie in such directions the fact that neither the religious establishments nor the popular schools of occultism and of the occult arts represent and convey the authentic values and the deeper aspirations of the human spirit, but that these are unknown to the vulgar masses, those who know the genuine approach, that there are such people who know the genuine approach, and that these are none other than, as explained in those books, the Brethren of the Rosy Cross. Now, just for the sake of fairness in historical accuracy, I should interject that by that time, about a century or so after the Reformation, the Protestant churches, which in Germany would of course be primarily the Lutheran Church, were not in much better shape intellectually and spiritually than the papacy that is somewhat derogated there. All one has to do is read about the life and the circumstances of another very, very interesting individual of the same general time period, namely Jacob Böhme, the shoemaker of Görlitz, as Manly Hall called him, one of also the great mystics, the mystical writers of the time, and see how the Lutheran clergy treated him. If those Lutheran ministers had access to their version of the unholy Inquisition, they would have burnt Jacob Böhme. So let's say religious narrowness and fanaticism is not the province of any one particular religion, but is rather widely spread. In any event, it was under such circumstances that the early Rosicrucian literature came out into the open. And so it seems that we are faced here with an eternal and ever-recurring dilemma, which the Rosicrucian authors of the 17th century were concerned with, and which I think also afflicts us today as much as it did afflict them. And I would say I would hazard an educated guess that it will afflict us in the future as well. So what dilemma am I talking about? The dilemma is related to the perennial tendency of the human mind toward reductionism. Well, what is reductionism? It may be defined as the reducing or confining of the vast, open-ended, mystical process of human transformation into hard and fact doctrines, into formulae that appear to be practical or useful because they serve the limited ends of the human ego. Jung referred to such theories and teachings as the nothing but teachings. In other words, when somebody says this is nothing but an astral journey, or this is nothing but the appearance of a master of the Himalayas, or this is nothing but, then I don't know, Saint Honorius the Skinny, or something like that. Whenever you reduce an unusual archetypal event to something very specific and usually very material, then you are doing something wrong. And what is it that you are doing that is wrong is you are not allowing the opportunity to your soul, the Greek word for which is psyche, to get into the act and to be stimulated by whatever you are talking about, but to really develop some deeper and stimulating and indeed transformative insights. See, what we don't tend to realize, although it seems like it would be a very evident circumstance, that unusual experiences, occult, metaphysical, whatever you want to call them, phenomena and theories and stories and things of that sort exist very largely for the purpose of stimulating unusual insights in us. In lieu of this, we, with our lower minds, with our ratiocinating, as the Victorians would call it, we reduce our relationship to these developments to information. Somebody goes into a trance and comes out with some wild story, I don't know, about Atlantis or about what may happen to our present world or so, and we take it as a disclosure, pure and simple. We don't let our psyche work on it. We don't try to look into it in greater depth. Well, actually, such teachings, stories, myths, whatever they may be, exist for the purpose of doing something to us, of stimulating us in particular directions. And when we neglect that, then we are making a great mistake. And so we need to keep that in mind, that so to use an example, I don't want to be sacrilegious about it, and I have a great respect for these religious figures, especially in an iconographic and in a mystical sense. But let's say when the Virgin Mary is regarded as the physical mother of Jesus and nothing more, then we have reduced a mysterious icon to a mere physiological function as such as a birth, or various other things of that sort. Because when we are confronted with such reductionistic statements, then again we come up against a wall. All right, so that's it. Or, but on the other hand, that's not it. That is an image. That is a way of trying to lead us to certain deeper recognitions. And when we don't engage in these recognitions, then all we tend to end up with is some kind of a dogma. And then after a while we get tired of dogmas. We said, I don't want to keep on believing, and then we throw the whole baby Jesus at Christmas time out with the bathwater. So to use a spontaneously produced metaphor. So this is the important thing, especially when we approach the mystical. And I would say that the occult without a mystical intention and a mystical center is not worth a great deal. And the problem is that this is easily forgotten. Why? Because we have these psychological functions, as Jung pointed them out, sensation and feeling and thinking and intuition. And these comprise the four segments of what depth psychology calls the ego, but which is really from a more profound and a more mystical perspective, our lesser self. There is so much more beyond the ego that if we concentrate on that, we are limiting ourselves tremendously. Yet when we don't look at the unusual experience and the unusual teachings in the light of understanding which would make them into a stimulus for our own experience, for our own insight, then we are really frustrating the entire process. Now, having dealt with the theosophical matrix now on 2 lectures, and since Max Heindel was a good member of the Theosophical Society as well for a long time, so we are still at the same. This is what happens to very worthwhile and potentially very illuminating and spiritually productive schools of thought and movements. Their content becomes reduced to a kind of quasi-factual information. And then it stops and doesn't go anywhere. And you don't change. You don't, as Jung would call, individuate. You don't experience. You merely, once again, as so often in spiritual matters, you are asked to believe, and that's it. That's not enough. And we are finding out in our present culture, really to my chagrin, because the effects of it are likely to be very unpleasant, that people don't want to believe anymore. Instead, we believed long enough, it hasn't done an awful lot for us, so let's go on to something else. And so what do they go on to? Information, which they are expected to believe also. So there you are in front of the computer, and there comes your dogma, your new dogma out of the computer. And sometimes it is called science, and sometimes it is called something else, but here you are from the frying pan into the fire, from having abandoned the area of religious belief, and now you are expected to become a technologically induced believer. So have you really gained so much? I don't think so. So this is the problem, because the problem is psychological, if you don't mind that word. And the psychological problem is that we have an ego. We are able to think and even think up various realities. We are capable of having our feelings stimulated, and of course we relate to the physical world and so forth, but with all of these we confine ourselves to a certain realm of reality which ultimately is not very helpful to us. And let's say to believe in, and we can go clear back with this to maybe to the late Renaissance, or certainly the 18th century, when our belief system calls itself science, it's still a belief system. And being a belief system, it's not creative. We are expected to believe what is put forth supposedly as the result of scientific inquiry. And then we believe that, then what? So you see, these things are very, very important. Also, we frequently forget, and the advocates of scientism, as Gerald Hurd called it. To be a scientist is one thing, but to believe in scientism, when scientism becomes your religion, that's a bad thing. But to believe in that is ultimately very frustrating, because it becomes another belief system that doesn't lead to anything. It really leads to a stagnating soul. When your soul stagnates, then nothing interesting happens. Don't you think we have experienced it over the last couple of years? Heavens to Betsy, certainly we have, and we still are. We are pushed by circumstances and the people who manipulate the circumstances into conditions where we are stagnating. Nothing comes in, nothing creative, nothing exciting, nothing that feels good. You know what? I don't need to tell you that that condition is really bad. But it always happens. It's a natural tendency of the human who is locked up in his ego, in that fourfold castle, as the alchemists depicted it, and there's no way out. And of course the alchemists had the answer. This is all symbolic, of course. There's a square. And that square is what we nowadays call the ego. It has the four corners, earth, water, fire, and air. And that in turn can be expressed in other ways too, as the four functions and all of that. We are all locked in. And we are not going to come out of that enclave unless we somehow burst it asunder. And of course that is what alchemy was doing, breaking down the physical elements and then looking for something new to come out. And this is true of all symbol systems. But the problem is that no matter how inspired and inspiring, no matter how fascinatingly occult an initial disclosure is, once people get hold of it, they make a system out of it. That's the kind of thing that Krishnamurti railed against, as we heard in our discussion in class time. You don't need a system. You need to know. You need to be right in there. And that is, I think that this difficulty can only be circumvented or handled correctly, is if we come to recognize that in this case the esoteric, let's say, but many, many other ideas in life are in the nature of myths. And as certainly Joseph Campbell has pointed out frequently and over again, the myth is creative. The myth brings forth insights and feelings and transformations into us that the fact won't, that the dogma won't, that the intellectual theory won't, because the myth is such that is its function. That has always been its function. From Egypt to Greece to the Arthurian myths and so forth. And this is very important. Now, it is my theory that the Rosicrucian dispensation, let us say, if we read the original Rosicrucian documents, and if we watch what happened to, let's say, the Rosicrucian tradition from that time on, was and perhaps still is designed to undo the damage that the dogmatic systematizers of religion and of that matter of the esoteric have done to the field. It was trying to redesign the mythos with the story of Christian Rosenkreuz and the founding of the Rosicrucian order, and the fact that you could never really go and find where the Rosicrucians or where they were. Never. You know? Oh yes, they're there. They're looking out for things. They've got the right story, but where are they? Oh no, we're not going to tell you that. So you might say that that's kind of pulling people's legs, but it isn't, because let's say the Rosicrucian tradition, in my estimation, from the very beginning, tried to elevate the esoteric onto a mythological level, on the mythological plateau. Now, why should that have happened? Well, you know, as I said, the aftermath of the Reformation in Western culture was a time of terrible disruption. And it resulted in things like the 30 Years' War and, you know, really terrible things. And along with the millions of people leaving the Catholic Church, along with such developments, you also had the loss of mysticism. Because whatever its faults, its shadow of the Catholic Church may have been, or maybe even include the Orthodox Church too. What the heck, the Greeks got a broad shoulder. But you know, let's say whatever their faults may have been, all throughout the almost 2,000 years of Christian history, they had real mystics. Maybe not all the ones who have been elevated to sainthood qualify for that. I mean, I certainly don't have much respect for the so-called Saint Dominic, for instance, the forefather of the Inquisition and things like that. There are always some people who are elevated to an iconic status who don't deserve that. But on the other hand, you know, what about the Saint Teresa of Avila? What about Catherine of Siena? And what about Saint Francis? And what about Thomas Aquinas, who was a magician before he was a monk, even, and things of that sort. There were always some there, right up to our own days, and Padre Pio of Italy. I mean, these are incredible spiritual giants who usually in their time are subjected to all kinds of bad stuff, indignities and persecutions and derogations and things of that sort. Even Padre Pio in our own time, I mean, I've never seen Padre Pio, but he certainly was alive when I was alive. I wrote about him clear back in the 1950s, I think. So, nevertheless, there were mystics there. And if someone was well-intentioned and well-guided and was looking for them, he would find them. Come Protestantism, no mysticism. Nah. Sing a few hymns, listen to a dull preacher for hours on end. Ich bin der Herr Pastor und predige euch was vor. Wenn ich nicht weiter kann, dann fange ich wieder von vorne an. Anyway, it's nice to come up with old silly German stories, but let's say there is no doubt about it, but that the Protestant Reformation, both in its Lutheran and in its Calvinistic branches, became a very dull business, very, very dull. And when your religion becomes dull, that's pretty bad. Because your religion should be exciting, your spirituality should be exciting, whatever it is. It should stimulate. It should stimulate the soul. It should bring the spirit out of the soul and the soul out of the body. And it can do that. But not when you reduce it to formulae and beliefs. But again, I am not saying these things to say something bad about Protestantism. It's merely, let's say, a historical recognition. But let's say this happens with everything. It happens with alchemy, a noble and inspiring art of transformation, which was a form of mysticism. But along come those people whom apparently Johann Valentin Andrea and these people thought badly, who are the low-class alchemists. They go around and go up to the rich people and tell them, look, if you pay me a lot of money, I'm going to make gold for you. And then you'll be even richer than you are. Now the smart rich people said, I'm going to keep my money, at least that is mine. I'm not going to go in for that and so forth. But it's a devolution and a degeneration of the discipline. Now, all right, now I'm going to say some things which, if they get to my theosophical brethren and sisters, may cause some raised eyebrows. Look what happened to various occult disciplines. In this particular case, we heard enough about it the last couple of Fridays, to theosophy. Very, very noble thing, very wonderful mythic structure, inspiring, that Blavatsky brought forward. Then, give it about 30 years or so after the death of Blavatsky, And what does it become? To a major extent, it becomes a belief system. If you believe in karma, if you believe in reincarnation, if you believe in the existence of the masters and a few other things, and maybe believe in Kundalini, then you're okay. And you know what? Belief in those things doesn't do a dad burn thing for you either. I've been an active member of the Theosophical Society since the early 1950s. I traveled 3 continents lecturing to Theosophists, and they are my dear friends. But this tendency to descend into a dogmatic framework which is unproductive of any real spiritual result is there. Is there in all of these situations. And so it is my impression, let us say, I won't even say my belief, since I'm knocking beliefs here, it is my impression that the Rosicrucian mystique was designed in order to bring the esoteric tradition, the esoterica of that particular time, out of triviality, out of belief systems, into an area of endeavor which became exciting, a mystery. And I don't mean a mystery like Sherlock Holmes, whom I revere. I think he's a most wonderful figure of a couple of 100 years, but a mystery along the line of the understanding of a mystery in ancient times. And what happens there? You take it out of the quasi-factual realm. You lift it into a realm of mystery. Speaking of such, for instance, a very prominent theosophist who's gone now a few years, the late Joy Mills, who had been here many times and things like that, very, very astute woman who spent, kind of like myself, practically her whole life in the Theosophical Society, only she was an official and things like that, which I never was. But let's see, she said to me in front of other people, she said, the secret doctrine is a myth. If it is not a myth, then it is nothing. What did she mean by that? Well, I didn't pick her brains, but I think I understood. What she meant was that the intention of Blavatsky behind writing these huge tomes, but in Victorian times people had a lot of time to read, and that's why the great novelists like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and so forth, big doggone books, which work very nicely when you are sitting beside a fireplace in cold Russia or somewhere, and you are transported into another realm of thought. But this is the issue, that really the occult, the esoteric, is, how should I put it? I have used that term before. It is a romance. If you are not a romantic, you're not going to make a good esotericist. Why? Because there has to be that exaltation, that excitement, the expectation of something marvelous, and marvelous is something that is a marvel. You see, and an entry into an exciting, a colorful, a mysterious world. But when you reduce that to a lower level, even though helpful, I admit, for instance, while I have no use for the concept beyond a certain limit, that the teaching of karma, which comes to us from the East, of course, is an improvement over a morality that is pursued because of the fear of eternal damnation. The karma is better than hell, but not that much better. Depending on what kind of karma you have, it can be pretty hellish, But the issue again being that to believe in these principles as a sort of salvific dogmas is very unfortunate. Now, if you want to look, and after all, he felt very close to the esoteric, to the Rosicrucian tradition. If you look at the what's left of them, of course, which are only in print now, of Manly Hall. If you look at Manly Hall's talks, you look at Manly Hall's books, you will discover there that there is woven into the how should I put it, the seeming substance, the seeming subject matter, there is woven in a romance. Manly Hall treated the esoteric tradition as a romance, in the sense that this is something that can be helpful, something that can be exciting, something that can make you feel right and feel good, and give you an understanding on an other than purely material or intellectual level. If Mr. Hall didn't do that, then he didn't do anything. He did that every single time. Now again, people don't come there and listen to a lecture and analyze it. Well, this is what he did. But that is what was done for people. And that is what needs to be done for people. And the problem was, as it always is, that here was Blavatsky, as I mentioned last time. Blavatsky was the romantic figure. She was the old witch and the fairy princess at the same time, and this stirred people up. People who were near her were near to the fire, and they never forgot that fire. But then afterwards, things got more drab and more unexciting in many ways, because they have been turned into a belief. Now I think I beat that horse now enough. But so now what the Rosicrucian effort, it would seem to me, was along these lines, that it wanted to restore a mystique, and by the way of the mystique, a romance to the esoteric. Not more teachings, and not even more promises of making gold and things like that. Something mysterious. And from the very there is a mysterious story of this German knight, Christian von Rosenkreuz, from whence the Rosicrucian name is derived. Christian, and the name means Christian Rosicrucian, who goes away from home and ends up in the Middle East, in a non-existent city called Damkar. But he receives certain inspiration and certain empowerments there. And he comes back with these to Europe and gathers a a small coterie of disciples around himself, whom he informs spiritually about these things, and then he dies and is buried in a mysterious tomb that is not known to anybody. But he also makes certain prophecies, and one of them is, 100 years from now I shall return. And he didn't mean reincarnate, but he meant that with his spiritual message he would return. And that until then the brethren of the Rosy Cross are supposed to stay mum. And after that too, that they will always be in the world, but nobody can find them. No specifics. And yet the brethren of the Rosy Cross, these people who were initiated into the greater mystery by Christian Rosenkreuz himself, will always be in the world, and they will exercise an influence, and they will keep the spiritual tradition alive. But very mysteriously, without any details, without any specifics, without anything to believe in, without anywhere to go. If you go and try to find the brethren of the Rosy Cross, you'll be on a fool's errand, because you can't find them. And well, you know, we can come up with various explanations for that. If we say that these people and these practices and these teachings exist, but not on a physical level. And after all, Blavatsky talked about these things everywhere, the astral level and so forth. Then we are coming close to it, because it means that we have to approach their mysteries inside of us, within us. It's not something that is even quasi-material. And I'm afraid very often from a certain time on, it was largely under the time of Annie Besant and her brilliant helper C.W. Leadbeater, that a lot of the theosophical teachings became step by step just a little bit too pat, too organized, too much. They began to lend themselves too much to a belief system, and that was not their objective to begin with. That was not what Blavatsky was all about, and that's not what Besant was all about either. But it's what the human mind is about. We want something to believe in. You see, we want karma and all these sorts of things, and by so doing, we begin to lose the real. And then we have to pray with the Hindus, oh, from the unreal lead me to the real. Because we have created the unreality even out of the real that we had. Because that's the nature of our doggone mind, you know. Maybe we should start a new system, the teachings of the doggone mind. In any event, you know, these are important issues. And now, the reason I brought all of this up was that it is my impression that the beginning of the Rosicrucian tradition, and indeed in many ways what continued subsequently, was really an effort to romanticize, re-mysticize the elements of the esoteric which were there. Because people were looking very much for the esoteric when the mystical that was in the Catholic Church was no longer available. But once again, what they did was not all that helpful. So it would seem that the early Rosicrucian literature was fighting reductionism, the reductionism of their time. It was against the false alchemists who were pretending to make gold. It was against the oppression of the human spirit on the part of dogmatic religion. It brought myth and mystery back into the alchemical and occult spiritual field. Very significant in the three first Rosicrucian books is the fact that no names and no data are given about the brethren of the Rosy Cross. None. Apparently one couldn't join them on the material plane, but one could meditate on the meaning of their symbols, and that was enough. And maybe that's a lesson to us, that it should be enough. Now the publications appearing between 1614 and 1620 themselves claim to be a revival rather than a beginning. Namely these books. In the Confessio it was stated that the mysterious founder of the order, Frater Christian Rosenkreuz, was born in 1378. He is stated in the Fama to have lived to the rather riper than usual age of 106 years. Now, that's quite a bit even for me. So he would have died in probably 1484 or thereabouts. In view of the prophecy which is written over the door of the famous vault that is described, but again nobody can go there, post centum viginti annos patibo, after 100 years I shall appear. I shall appear, and 120, centum viginti, yes, 120 years I shall appear. So the publication of the first of the literature would have coincided roughly with the prophesied reappearance, because that is describing supposedly a past event. The myth thus has to do with the cycles of reappearance and the cycles of obscuration as well. The Rosy Cross is not envisioned as ever not having existed, but as being periodically revived. And such a revival occurred no doubt in the early part of the 20th century, or for that matter, perhaps in the latter part of the 19th. The excitement created by the revelations given forth in the three Rosicrucian books in the early 1600s never really died down. In the 1700s, which is 18th century, the Rosicrucian revival entered or merged with the traditions of Freemasonry. Numerous Masonic jurisdictions began to incorporate the symbolism of the Rosy Cross, and they are still there. And there were others. So that there's no need for me to go into details as to what degrees of initiation with Rosicrucian symbolism exist in Freemasonry. They are there, and those of us who, let's say, are within that fold know about them. But so there were various ways in which the attention was being called again and again to the Rosy Cross, but always in a mysterious manner. Nobody ever met a Rosicrucian. So this needs to be kept in mind. Now, I need to, because otherwise I will really be remiss. But once again, when one is speaking primarily history, primarily factually, there's only so much to say. Why? Because facts are not that interesting. And while I always had a good grade in history, and I still love history, it's really a dreary pursuit. The story of the miseries, of the horrors, and the stupidity of the human race. No doubt about it, no doubt about it. Now with that, go and become a history professor. So a very interesting and very lovely man. Undoubtedly there are others whom I don't know about. But let's say this is the only one that I know about who I would say really carried forth this, what to me looks this mystical, romantic intentionality into the modern world, and who did it by way of Rosicrucian symbolism was the gentleman who certainly in the latter part of his life was our fellow Californian, who went under the nom de plume of Max Heindel, born in the late 19th century in Germany, born in 1865, and who lived in Los Angeles and in Southern California thereafter. He was from a noble German family. His family name was Maximilian von Grashof, although some other first names have been attributed to him too. He was a man, in spite of his noble family background, he was a man of very modest means all his life. I think Manly Hall said one time, when speaking of Max Heindel, whom he knew quite well, that he never could afford a suit any more, or for any more expensive material than gabardine. Max Heindel. That he was a very modest man. He wore even modest clothing, simply because he didn't have it. But let's say, nevertheless, his other two names, because I'm sure you were burning up to find out, were Karl Ludwig Maximilian von Grashof. In any event, he was respected and generally beloved by everyone who knew him personally. His attraction to the occult and heterodox mystical tradition was really a lifelong one, and he soon found himself associating, after his immigration to America, with that fountainhead of much spirituality, because it certainly was, and it still can be, known as Theosophy. In 1903 in Los Angeles, he listened to a lecture by a prominent theosophist by the name of Charles Webster Leadbeater, who was the close associate and advisor of Annie Besant. C.W.L. was also a liberal Catholic bishop. Very interesting man, and as I like to hint, and I never tell you, but in Australia I think I saw his ghost, which delighted me. In any event, heard that one lecture by Leadbeater, and he said, "This is it. This is for me." So now he not only joined the Theosophical Society, but he, in the early 1900s, a theosophist of German extraction but living here in the USA, Dr. Alma von Brandis, took him to Europe, took Max Heindel to Europe. by where it meant that she wanted to introduce him there, and she undoubtedly paid for his journey. And she took him to Europe for the express purpose of visiting Dr. Rudolf Steiner. Now, I can't go on and we'll be here all night, and then you're not going to come back at all after this Friday. But let's see, Rudolf Steiner by that time was a very famous representative of the esoteric tradition in Europe. He was the head of the Theosophical Society of German language for quite a long time. He had a large personal following, later on started his own movement called Anthroposophy, and was, according to all reports, an extremely interesting fellow. He was not a German, he was an Austrian. Well, he was from the Austrian and Slovenian border. That's where he was raised. But he went to university in Berlin, and from then on he was turned very German. But he sort of, and I'm not going to go into too much about Steiner, but let's say, just to quickly say, well, you know, he ended up in Switzerland, in Dornach near Basel, and the greatest likelihood of him moving to Switzerland was that he smelled something coming, because this was, and that something was Adolf Hitler, and he didn't want to be confronted with the horror that was coming in Germany, and being a man of perception, he knew that. So he went to Switzerland and established a big center there, which is still there, and a very accomplished and very interesting man, let's put it that way. And at this time, he was still very connected with the Theosophical tradition too. So Heindel became an enthusiastic follower of Steiner, who at that time still functioned within the Theosophical Society. Max Heindel became a field lecturer for the Theosophical Society and an officer in several of its branches here in the USA, and was quite popular. 1908 in Seattle, of all places, he was just there, I think, on a lecture tour, but he was there for several weeks. He wrote a book, which was really the only full book that he ever wrote. And it is entitled The Rosicrucian Cosmoconception. And the followers of Max Heindel right to the present day generally refer to the book as the Cosmo. So if they ask you, have you read the Cosmo? That's what they are talking about. And in 1911, he moved to Oceanside, California, in our Southern California, where he established the headquarters in Oceanside. It is still there, and the organization is still functioning. It's a lovely place. So if you are sometimes on your way to San Diego and you would like to stop off in an interesting place, then it's sort of on a hillside in Oceanside, and it's called Mount Ecclesia, and that was his headquarters. On not quite 10 years after that, on January 6th, on the Feast of the Epiphany, he passed away in Oceanside in 1919. He didn't have a very long life. He was only in his 60s. In or around 1916, so about 3 years before Max Heindel's death, a young man of Canadian birth and of East USA upbringing by the name of Manly Palmer Hall came to Mount Ecclesia and to Max Heindel. And he and Max Heindel became quite friendly, and Mr. Hall remained there at Max Heindel's headquarters. Now don't hold me to this, but I think to around a year. He was always grateful to Max Heindel. He always spoke in very laudatory terms of him. And I feel, but one can feel things. I feel that Max Heindel passed something on to Manly Hall. And it was, the Rosicrucians often talked about initiation. I think Max Heindel, who himself, let's say, had entered a deeper form of consciousness, he even spoke about it. He had one great mystical experience, and then he sort of drew on that for the rest of his life, but he also had others. I think he had the capacity to help induct others of a worthy nature into similar experiences, and I think one of them was Manly P. Hall. And Manly P. Hall had always spoken very highly of him, and when it comes right down to it, and it's also just little anecdotal things, but I have on at least 2 separate occasions heard Mr. Hall in a smaller company in the library where we celebrated his birthday, and Christmas party every year was very, very nice, with a nice, big, sweet, sugary cake, which Mr. Hall preferred. But let's say I twice heard him sort of inadvertently say that he himself was a Rosicrucian. And the way it came out was there was some little jabberwocky with some people who were there. Sometimes they said, well, what I don't know, probably whether they asked him whether he was close to Buddhism, and he wrote beautifully about Buddhism, he wrote beautifully about Taoism, and he said no. He says, we are a Christian organization, and I am too. And then he said, well, Rosicrucian. And he said that once, and he said it another time too. So let's say that his Christianity was a Rosicrucian Christianity. So whatever that may mean, but I think something, passed on a certain kind of mystical succession, empowerment was passed on to Manly Palmer Hall by Max Heindel, and it remained. So I think that another person whom I knew was an interesting woman. By the time I knew her, she was fairly aged. Her name was Corinne Helene. You won't hear very much about her nowadays, but Corinne Helene was a disciple of Max Heindel. But when after Heindel's death and when his wife took over and things like that, there were, as it always happens, there were some of his membership there who left Oceanside, and Corinne Helene was one. Her particular inspiration was that she wrote several volumes of volumes that were voluminous of esoteric interpretations of the Bible, both Old and New Testament. Very interesting material. And I met her by circumstance because Corinne Helene and her husband owned a very nice house up in the sort of on the on the slopes of Mount Washington. In any event, I knew somebody who rented an apartment from them, and I was visiting that person, then I met them. Very interesting people, and certainly another sort of inspiration coming from Max Heindel that bore a very interesting fruit. They were published rather privately, so you probably don't find too many of them, and they were called, and this was long before anybody used the term New Age. They were called the New Age Bible Interpretation. By Corinne Helene. I have to quit now because otherwise none of you are going to come back. Or maybe a very few will. But in any event, let's say, so he founded an organization, somewhat on the model of the Theosophical Society. It's called the Rosicrucian Fellowship. It had fairly widespread membership, particularly in Latin America, and it still does. And its headquarters is there in Oceanside, and there are still members. And it was always a very dignified, a very honest. If you folks would like to sit down, please do so. We are about at the end of our meeting. Fortunately, we have a big room, and you can sit down wherever you wish, and you will probably experience that greatest of all gifts, social, what do you call it, social distancing. So you see, you can do that here. Anyway, I'm sure you're tremendously happy about it. It just sends you into ecstasies. But let's say his, and I would say of various Rosicrucian organizations, because there were some in France and here, everywhere. Max Heindel's, I think, was the most mystical, the most low-key, and the most honest. Let's say the only one that sort of superseded his Rosicrucian Fellowship was another organization, and I'm not saying anything bad about them. I think they did a great deal of good in many places. They had a vast membership particularly in Central and South America and then North America, and that is what came to be called the Amorc, Ancient Mystical Order Rosicrucis, founded by a gentleman named H. Spencer Lewis. And they, bye-bye. See, well, it's okay, you have it's late, you have things to do. What those folks did, they outdid everybody in promotion, because they latched onto something that in the 1920s, 1930s, when they were founded, was a big deal, and that was correspondence courses. And so in every kind of publication, you would find, for years and years and years, you would find advertisements. And I have a kind of a cute take on one of that, so even though it's late, I'm going to tell you. It was, for instance, an advertisement showing an all-seeing eye or a pyramid or something, and then it would say, Akhenaton, and Akhenaton, Benjamin Franklin, Franklin Roosevelt. What did they have in common? They were all Rosicrucians, it said underneath. So write to post office box so-and-so in San Jose, and with these means then they would say, you could live in Alaska, you could live on the North Pole or the South Pole. They would send you their lessons every month for several years. And they also had individual groups further there. So there was nothing bad about those folk. But let's say very American in their salesmanship, which was not true of Heindel. But let's say then, and the teachings were sort of revised theosophy and with a Rosicrucian mantle over it. There was nothing bad about it at all. And they did spread, let's say, the esoteric message far and wide. But let's say it's just my intuitive sense, also based because Heindel only wrote that one book, Rosicrucian Cosmoconception, but he had reprints of his lectures, quite a few. Most of it, I think, published in Oceanside. So I know his material to a considerable extent, and I think on the basis of it, and otherwise, I can testify that he was probably the best representative of the mystical approach to Rosicrucianism, and that in his own experiences he brought something important and valuable and beautiful and exciting. And that this should be recognized, because such people are indeed few in number. And so we had another little window tonight into the esoteric tradition, into a particular chamber where the expatriate German nobleman, the humble and unassuming mystic Max Heindel, worked and brought forth a very, very important keynote, a very important message, for which I think humanity, not only in Los Angeles or in California, but in many other places, was grateful and ought to remain grateful, because as one of the great souls that had come and that did a very valuable work, and had also passed on the whatever it is, the baton, to another very, very important person who was Manly Palmer Hall. And with people like that, you can't lose. These were signal people who did great and wonderful things for us, and whose heritage, whose legacy is never really going to go away. And I think for that we ought to be grateful. And I hope that this has also been of some interest to you. I apologize for running over time, and I promise you that I'm not going to do it the next series except when I feel like it. All right, so thanks so much, guys, and we'll see you soon.